Hello, this is Mark Tooley, President of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, with the pleasure today of conversation with Jed Atkins, author of a new book, The Christian Origins of Tolerance, a topic very close to the heart of our organization. Jed teaches at Duke University. Jed, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Mark, it's great to be here. And I should say that I taught at Duke University until last year.
Oh,
In the previous year, I had to move to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I'm the dean of the New School for Civic Life and Leadership. And I also hold a chair on the philosophy of living.
well, that's excellent. Your book makes some, to my mind, some groundbreaking discoveries or affirmations of the seeds of tolerance that were planted in the early church, especially in North Africa. Could you explain?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. In the book, what I really try to do is uh, there's a standard narrative that is well known. I call it the standard liberal narrative because it gets picked up by liberal political thought generally, which says that religious toleration emerged from the post-Reformation wars of religion. It's a solution to the problem of violence that then requires the imposition of state power. And also, as a result of this, they say that toleration requires a commitment and a separation between justice and judgments about justice and the common good. And this narrative has a very powerful hold on the modern sort of imagination when it comes to speaking about tolerance. And what I try to do in the book is I try to set aside this standard liberal narrative about when tolerance starts. And what I do is then I turn back to the ancient world, and in particular to North Africa, Roman North Africa in the first 5 centuries, in which I argue that tolerance emerges from a tradition of North African thinkers that are reading St. Paul, that are engaging with Stoicism and in conversation with each other. And this tradition understands tolerance is patience within plurality. It doesn't necessarily require the separation of church and state, and it also doesn't necessarily separate judgment about the good uh, uh, from from tolerance. And so ultimately, this tradition, people that are important are people like Tertullian, Cyprian, Lactantius, and St. Augustine. And it's theological. They begin by thinking about God's roles as a patient father and a just judge. And then from that, they work out accounts of political authority and judgment, and then patience within plurality, which is so important for toleration.
The average layperson listening to you would say, "Oh, wait, Augustine, didn't he want to harness the power of the state to suppress heresy?" So, how do you rectify this paradox?
Yeah, on one interpretation of tolerance, which is told by many scholars, but maybe most prominently by one of John Rawls's students, Rainer Forrest, is that there were some developments of tolerance with people like, let's say, Tertullian and Lactantius, and then with Saint Augustine, it all fell apart. And what I want to argue is with Saint Augustine, when you face up to the fact that tradition of toleration begins by saying you have to give an account of justice and judgment. And only once you face up to your responsibility to judge, then you're able to forbear. It actually shows that Augustine is applying the tradition rather than undoing it. The instance that people talk about is the Donatists, which was a breakaway Christian sect in North Africa that felt that they themselves held the only legitimacy when, under persecution of the church in the third century, members of the church, of the Catholic, what became the Catholic Church, handed over the scriptures to persecution. And after almost a century of debate, the Donatists resorted to using violence, and so Augustine, as he's facing up to what to do with this sect, in a letter to Vicentius, uh, who was a mild Donatist, he spouted a case, and he argues for both judgment, but then also which everyone focuses on, but then also tolerance. So he says when you're committing violence against other people, he says to tolerate wouldn't be the right thing. To show patience wouldn't be the right thing in the face of justice. And only once one fulfills our obligation to justice, then we're in a position for patience within plurality. The logic of this, sometimes I like to drive it home with a more contemporary example. Martin Luther Jr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail, in which he argues that patience that doesn't also face up to the obligations to justice is a patience that perhaps is not justified. And so you have to give an account of both our obligations to justice, and then once those have been satisfied and fulfilled, only then can we forbear, and the forbearance of tolerance then becomes in order. So I think the logic is sound, and Augustine himself is arguing for and applying that type of logic. This earlier tradition, what's different from, let's say, the later tradition, people that might be familiar with John Rawls, for instance, is in this earlier tradition, they hold together both justice and patience, and both are necessary in a fully orbed account of toleration within a diverse political community.
What is brewing in North African Christianity that leads to this insight distinct from European or Asian Christianity?
Well, one thing that I think is fascinating about telling the story, or the history of toleration that I want to tell, is that tolerance that is seen to come out of Europe actually has a distant origins actually in North Africa, and some of the earliest theological reflection were done by North African Christians, even though the later tradition will separate and take out different parts of it and take it in a different direction. What is brewing in North Africa is, I think, a couple of different things. Number one, it's a time of intense persecution. Christianity is a minority of the population. Second, and the persecution there becomes quite intense, going all the way up to Diocletian, an emperor who in 303 to 305 launched a great persecution of the church. Second of all, it's a time of great plurality. You have Christians and Jews and polytheists living side by side. Those communities are side by side, and so you have a sense of great plurality. And then the third thing you have is you have a great movement of intellectual renaissance, in which people like Cicero and Seneca are being deeply read by people like Tertullian and Lactantius. And so you have a great both theological and philosophical renaissance. And so that kind of mixture of persecution and plurality, and then philosophical and theological and legal renaissance led to some really productive thinking about toleration at this time in history.
And the North African Christian insights about tolerance, perhaps we're learning from the Stoics and others in Roman antiquity, and yet we're distinct. How so?
Yeah, that's great. Well, the first couple of chapters of my book are pushing back on a narrative, and it's a narrative that's important for this later tradition I told you about, what I call the standard liberal tradition, which has a sort of a myth of monotheistic violence. And so the tradition assumes that Roman polytheistic religions were generally tolerant, and then you couldn't have something like intolerance until you have monotheism, in particular Christian monotheism, coming on to the stage. And what I want to argue in the book is that there's some assumptions that are built in about religion and violence that undergird that account that simply don't hold in the ancient world. So one example is Roman polytheism actually was linked to empire at Rome, and Roman polytheistic rites tended to absorb the religions of the conquered people, to literally have a process of summoning their gods away into the city of Rome in order to conquer them. And we don't consider that in any way, that type of conquest, to be tolerant at all. So there's some myths about the history. Uh, uh, where there's an interesting sort of story has to do with the Stoics. And the Stoics themselves had a sense of patience, and they developed the vocabulary for patience as an important virtue, just like early Christianity. The difference is that for the Stoics, the patience or tolerantia in Latin never could become a political virtue of tolerance, because the Stoics had a philosophy of autonomy, in which the things that were outside of us, things like health, or the goods of the body, and money. A lot of the goods of politics are simply indifference to us. And if you think about tolerance as something that means putting up and forbearing evil or things that are uncomfortable we don't like, for the Stoics, those simply aren't evils and they simply go away. And so tolerance at best for the Stoics becomes a very personal ideal, unconnected from the political life. Whereas for the North African traditions, tolerance is patience within plurality, and those external sufferings are real sufferings. And so there is a real sense of forbearing evil, so that tolerance then becomes a political good. And as Augustine will say later on, it's a secular virtue, a virtue that's fitted for the seculum, for this age, a virtue in which the cities are intermingled and intermixed. And so for the Stoics, tolerance and patience is not such of a virtue. But for the Christians, it is a virtue that becomes fitted for the society in which there's real evils and real goods.
For the church fathers with these insights, which scriptures were most influential for them on these points?
Yeah, no, this is great. And the first chapter of or the second chapter of the book is called Paul and the New Testament Building Blocks of tolerance. And I argue that Paul puts in a theological framework for this, in which he thinks about God as a patient father and a just judge. And so you have to have judgment within political communities, and within the church community, as well as patience. And often one of the insights of tolerance is a type of humility that understands that judgment is not up to us, but to God. At the same time, just as God is patient as a father, so also we need to be, who are members of the community, whether the state or the church, need to be patient to one another. So some very important scriptures for the early church on this regard is going to be, especially for thinking about the role of sort of being together in plurality within the church. 1 Corinthians 12, 13. Uh, uh, 1 Corinthians 13 is a very important passage. It's often read at weddings, talking about love. And there's a passage, 1 Corinthians 13:7, love endures all things. And this was a passage that gets translated part by Tertullian and then later on Cyprian, in terms of love tolerates all things, it puts up with. And so the understanding there is just within the church, just that you have many bodies and with many responsibilities and many parts. Sometimes you have to put up with difficult people in order to love with your neighbor. So Cyprian and Tertullian, in works on patience, develop this out. And Cyprian goes further and argues that it's not just loving people within church, but of course, who is your neighbor? Well, neighbor love actually leads you to want to hang in there with people that are in the political community outside of your church. And so Tertullian, in this work on the good of patience, and written in in the mid third century, during a time of persecution of the church, develops out a theology of toleration through a very close reading of Paul, 1 Corinthians 7. Sorry, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 7.
And so, is this appreciation of tolerance undergirded by patience, taught by some of these church fathers, when Christianity becomes more established, are they simply forgotten, or are these teachings always there but not fully appreciated till later?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the fascinating parts of this story, which you find resonating in other parts of thinking about toleration, is thinking about tolerance often comes out of very particular contexts. Very particular contexts, such as, I mentioned Cyprian in the persecution of the church in the 250s, or Lactantius in the Great Persecution from 303 to 305. And there's a theology that comes out of this. The virtue of patience that I talked about before, but also a legal grounding in which the freedom of religion, for instance, that puts limits on the type of judgment that the political authorities can make, that Tertullian appeals to, for instance, and Lactantius, where they say that libertas religionis, as Tertullian, third century apologist, writes in his great work, The Apology. First time that the freedom of religion is written in history, is that term is used in history. There's a juridical part to it as well. And so what we actually find is we find that the virtue part of patient endurance, I think, has more resonance within the Christian tradition. The legal part of it, that puts limits on judgment so that patients can be space for patients, begins to be taken over by both Christians and those who are not Christians later in the empire. So a great example of this would be in the so-called Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan is something that was promulgated by Licinius, a pagan emperor, and Constantine. It's the so-called Edict of Milan because it's not technically uh, an edict in the technical sense, but they say there in the Edict of Milan that they say, since you see that this has been granted to us by these same Christians, your devotedness understands also that to others the right of open and free observance of their worship has been granted, in accordance with the peace of their times, to exercise their free choice in worshiping as each one sees fit. So there we see an example of this policy in the empire that draws on some of the language of freedom of religion and Tertullian and Lactantius and applies it across the empire. We also see principles being appealed to by people. But by pagans in the fourth century, as Christianity rose in power, to say that the freedom of religion that you argued for as a basis of toleration should also be applied to you. So the moral of the story is, even though toleration and arguments appeal under particular contexts and times, that kind of thinking and principles that come out of this and virtues that come out of this can transcend time and place and be relevant to other times and place, and even by people with different backgrounds and viewpoints.
The Protestant enthusiasts for religious toleration and freedom of conscience, John Locke or John Milton, did they have any idea of this history, or did they think they had to go back to the scriptures to find these insights?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Locke is the one that when you think about toleration, most people turn to. He is somebody who, obviously his letter concerning toleration is very important and is something that is taught in political science classes, a lot at the undergraduate level. I will say that he's maybe his work maybe is not the first. Pierre Bayle has a really important work on thinking about toleration that became written as a response to Saint Augustine. But Locke himself knew and even echoed the theological arguments for toleration, beginning from the beliefs that God was a patient father and a just judge. You see it a bit in his letter concerning toleration, but you also see it in his 1695 work, The Reasonableness of Christianity, where Locke promotes a type of, you might say, creedal minimalism, where he presents God as a patient father and a just judge. And then he gives you an eschatological framework of God's final just judgment of all human beings according to their deeds. And he does represent this age as one of divine patience. And so that understanding of the theological trajectory and also the eschatological trajectory is something that he is, I think, echoing this earlier tradition. Of course, what becomes that's not the major theme in Locke's account of toleration. The larger theme in Locke is a separation of church and state. Is a really important part of this, as well as a type of social contract that becomes very important. And those are some parts of the Christian tradition, the North Africa tradition that drop out. And ultimately, Locke then sets the later tradition on a very different footing. So he was aware of it, but he did not, anchor his main arguments for toleration. And he offers many arguments for toleration, but he does not anchor them in that earlier tradition.
Your book seems very timely in that obviously there are many who are secular who deem Christianity to be intrinsically intolerant. And in reaction to, there are now some Christian post liberals who also reject tolerance. Did you have these currents in mind as you did your work?
I very much did. In the epilogue of the book takes this argument directly into account. I argue that the traditional liberal narrative sets up some binaries that either, and so people in this traditional liberal narrative I mentioned sort of Locke, but later on, of course, very famously John Rawls, who I think has the most maybe powerful account of toleration in his a theory of justice, and then later on political liberalism, really takes this and assumes this traditional narrative, historical narrative that underlines his normative conceptual account. And so what you end up finding is you actually end up finding the later tradition is very clear on providing a type of dualism where you either have a separation of church and state that comes out of Protestantism in a very particular way, or you don't have tolerance, and that becomes very challenging. It becomes challenging for instance, Muslims and Islam, which is something that from Locke to Rawls, this traditional narrative wrestles with, and it also, if you follow this traditional narrative, it keeps you from seeing this North African tradition. And so, in the conclusion of the book, I have something to say for both political theorists and for traditional believers of, let's say, Christianity and Islam. That for political theorists, I think we, especially with the development of comparative political theory, we have an opportunity to be able to say, hey, there needs to be some space to realize things are not just black and white when it comes to tolerance, and that there's room for theological accounts of tolerance that have thick commitments to religious traditions to do some work. And on the other hand, for traditional believers of Christianity and Islam, and I think one is that there's an opportunity within their own traditions to both of whom have an account of God as patient father and just judge, have account of developing over time, a deferral of judgment, an account of patience within community, to go back into their traditions and do some work. And what is so relevant about this early North African tradition is that when you look at the growth of religion, it's happening in the global South, in which the types of let's say Christianity is very traditional, and so I argue let's not ask believers to become good secular Rawlsians if you're going to be tolerant, but rather let's recognize that there's great, rich theological resources that go back to the foundings of Christianity that can do some really good normative and theological work for thinking about how to live together patiently in a pluralistic community.
Did you have a copy of the book within reach?
I do. I have it right here. Oops. I have the
Hold
background
it
blurred here.
so we can read it. Pull the book back closer to your face. Very good.
Sorry, I have the screen on background on blur here.
Excellent. The Christian Origins Tolerance by Jed Atkins. Thank you very much, Jed, for a very enjoyable and informative conversation.
No, thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.